Hello, and welcome back to History for the HSC, where we're continuing our study of the HSC Modern History core topic of power and authority, looking at the collapse of the Weimar Republic. In today's deep dive, we're going to be focusing on the following syllabus outcomes. Firstly, the conditions that enabled dictators to rise to power in the interwar period. However, this time we're going to be looking at the conditions in Germany that allowed the dictatorship of Hitler to arise. However, the main focus of today's deep dive will be the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler in Germany, but more specifically, the second half of this syllabus dot point, the collapse of the Weimar Republic. So please join us on our deep dive into the collapse of the Weimar Republic. Now, as usual, we will be breaking down this topic into some smaller chunks. And today those chunks are going to be, firstly, the Weimar Republic itself and how it operated, what the organizations of governments were, and what some of the issues with that were to begin with. Secondly, we're going to look at some of the challenges and the early struggles that the Weimar Republic faced coming out of the Treaty of Versailles and during the interwar period. We're then going to focus on what is sometimes called the golden years of the Weimar Republic, particularly under Minister Stresemann, and how the Weimar Republic looked as if it were going to solve many of these problems and go on to great things. And lastly, we're going to look at the eventual collapse of the Weimar Republic, what caused that, and how that sowed the seeds for the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. So please join me as we study the collapse of the Weimar Republic. Let's start with the organization of the Weimar Constitution and the government in the Weimar Republic. How it operated helps us to understand the reasons for its later failure. We will start with the citizens. Under the Weimar Constitution, voters were German citizens aged 20 years and older, both male and female. And this is actually one of the strong points of the Weimar Constitution. It predated women's suffrage movements in Britain and the USA by several years. Citizens could vote for a parliament called the Reichstag. This was a key democratic body within the government. Voting for it would take place every 4 years. The voting system was quite different, perhaps, to what you're used to. It used a system called proportional representation. In effect, this would mean that for every 60,000 votes a party received, it would achieve 1 seat in the Reichstag. This was a very democratic method of voting, however, did cause issues for the Republic, as we will see later. As the primary instrument of government, the Reichstag was the most important of the 2 houses of government under the Weimar Republic, responsible for making laws and taxation. The second key instrument of the government that citizens could vote for was the president. They were elected every 7 years and had significant power as the head of state of the Weimar Republic. These powers included, but were not exclusive to, emergency rule without the will of the Reichstag in situations of crisis through something called Article 48. We'll come back to that later. Also, dissolving parliament and calling new elections, appointing judges, and being commander-in-chief of the army. The president also appointed the chancellor. The chancellor would be elected every 4 years and was responsible for leading the government, choosing his ministers and proposing laws, the Reichstag. The chancellor required a 2/3 majority of the Reichstag in order to govern, and so as such was generally the leader of the largest party in the parliament. This too, we will see, would cause problems for the Weimar Republic later on. The last instrument of government that existed was the Reichsrat. This was the second house of the Weimar Republic and was appointed every 4 years. Unlike the Reichstag, it was not elected, but appointed by the various provisional governments and represented the different regions of Germany. It had existed in previous incarnations of the German constitution under the Kaiser. However, the Weimar Constitution had severely limited its powers. The Reichsrat did not have the power to make laws itself. It could only approve laws made by the Reichstag. However, it did have the power to stop the passage of laws they disagreed with, effectively vetoing the decisions of the democratically elected government. This, however, could be overturned by a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag. The Weimar Constitution had many strengths and weaknesses, and it is worth us now spending a little bit of time considering them before we move on. One clear strength of the Constitution are the various checks and balances that existed on the powers of individuals within the state. For example, while the President appointed the Chancellor, he could not make laws himself, and the President himself was also elected, so could be held to account by the general public via election. And whilst the Chancellor might choose what laws should be passed, he needed the Reichstag and generally the Reichsrat to agree to them. Further, the Reichstag could be dissolved, and this was especially important if it was not able to govern effectively, a frequent problem within the Weimar Republic. Secondly, it was without a doubt extremely democratic. German citizens could all vote for their representatives at various levels. Now, this was a far cry from the autocratic regime that had existed under the Kaiser, and was even more democratic than other Western democracies at the time. Even the concept of proportional representation meant that everyone's political opinion had a real impact on the makeup of the Reichstag. Unlike in Australia, where our two-party preferred system realistically means there's often no point voting for a minor party, in Weimar Germany, these minor parties made up a significant number of seats within the parliament. This, however, brings us to one of the key weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution: the number of coalition governments that needed to be formed. With the system of proportional representation that the Reichstag used, it was frequently made up of small party and factional groups. In the 13 years of the Weimar Republic, 40 separate political parties held seats at various points. Whilst this is theoretically democratic, it is also undoubtedly problematic for the formation of a steady government. The Chancellor, remember, required a support from a 2/3 majority of the Reichstag. But under this proportional representation system, this was never realistically going to happen. Consider, for example, the elections of May 1924, where 13 different parties gained seats, and at least 30 parties received over 1,000 votes. The Social Democrat Party received the most votes, receiving 100 seats. They were followed by the German National People's Party, who received 95 seats, the Centre Party, who received 65 seats, and the Communist Party, who received 62 seats. It would have taken a coalition of these four most powerful parties in the parliament to form a functioning government. And they were ideologically opposed on almost everything, with some, such as the Communist Party, unashamedly calling for the downfall of the Weimar Republic in general. 9 other political parties would make up the rest of the Reichstag. And the result of this was a series of weak coalition governments, which led to generally poor political management and frequent requirement upon the President to dissolve Parliament and call for new elections. This May 1924 Parliament, for example, would only last until October in the same year, when the President would call for its dissolvement and for new elections in December. This was a 5-month period between elections. Increasingly, this led to a situation where Germany was governed by the President via Article 48. Article 48 states that the president may use the army in cases of disturbance or danger. They may suspend fundamental rights in times of danger. The Reichstag can demand them back. This effectively gave the president dictatorial powers in times of crisis. This was designed as an emergency measure, but in the face of increasingly dysfunctional government, various chancellors and presidents made use of it, in part because it offered the only real manner in which good governance could actually occur. The last consideration for the weakness of the Weimar Constitution is the popular opinion of the government. We've already seen in our deep dive into the Paris Peace Conference that this government did not have the support and the trust of a lot of the public, and this can be seen through the large number of political parties, along with many extreme left and extreme right parties receiving large numbers of votes. So this was the Weimar Republic that would have to face several significant challenges to its power and authority. Ultimately, what we'll see in this lesson is how they failed, and how this failure, along with the structural issues at the basis of the Constitution, allowed for a legal dictatorship to develop. One of the first major challenges faced by the Weimar Republic was the French occupation of the Ruhr Valley in 1923. The origins of this occurred or began at the Paris peace talks, where the Treaty of Versailles was negotiated and Germany was not invited. The result of this, as we saw in our video on the Paris peace talks, was a deeply flawed treaty that unfairly treated the Central Powers, and in particular Germany, and sowed the seeds of dictatorship and the failure of the Weimar Republic. Significantly, the German government had been forced to agree to Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, which stated, "The Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts responsibility of, Germany and her allies for causing all of the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected to as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies." In essence, what this meant was Germany accepted responsibility for the war and the accompanying reparation payments to the Allies. The occupation of the Ruhr occurred as a result of Germany defaulting on these repayments to the Allies, as stipulated by the Treaty of Versailles. These reparation payments had been set at 132 billion gold marks, and had effectively crippled the German economy. In fact, the fact that some of these payments took the form of raw materials such as coal and iron crippled them even further. This made it all but impossible for the Weimar Republic to rebuild their economy and meet the demands of future reparation payments. By late 1922, this had reached crisis point, with the Germans frequently defaulting on reparation payments. When they again defaulted on their coal shipment to France in January 1923, it was the 34th time this had occurred in the previous 36 months. Now, it's important to understand that despite the horrendous impact these reparation payments were having on Germany, they were incredibly important to France. Their huge losses during the war were being regained by the boost to their economy via German reparations. And so as they saw this money dwindling away, they realized they needed to act. By the 11th of January, 1923, the French President Poincaré recognized he needed to act, and he sent in the French army to occupy the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, the center of coal, iron, and steel production in the country. From this point on, German production from the Ruhr would flow straight back to France, further worsening the German economy. Unable to do anything to stop the invasion due to the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar government instead encouraged their citizens in the Ruhr to mobilize in a campaign of passive resistance. Unions were encouraged to engage in strike action, essentially stopping most production within the region. Significantly, the decision was also made by government to continue to pay these workers and civil workers in the Ruhr, despite no work being completed. This was a fundamentally critical decision. The German economy was in no position to be able to meet the demands of paying these workers. It had been crippled firstly by the reparation payments, and then secondly by the French occupation of the Ruhr. The result was a hyperinflation crisis. Hyperinflation occurs when prices of objects and wages rise at such a significant level that the currency ceases to have any real value. Now, what caused this crisis is still somewhat open for debate. Was it the Weimar government's decision to continue paying striking workers during the Ruhr occupation? In order to do this, they did print more and more money, and so it certainly played a significant role. However, others have pointed out that the German economy was well on the way toward a period of hyperinflation prior to the French occupation of the Ruhr. That the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles had crippled the German economy, or further, that the German government during World War II had debt financed in such a way, presuming that it would make up for its losses through its post-war gains. And the economy following the war was in trouble because of this, and it had only gotten worse. The value of the German mark dissolved almost overnight. At the end of World War I, it had cost around 1 mark to buy a loaf of bread. By November 1923, the height of the hyperinflation crisis, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Banknotes were used as wallpapers, such as in this picture, but beyond that, children used it as toys. They were used to burn because it was cheaper than firewood, with workers being paid several times a day just to keep up with inflation. Now, this crisis impacted the German citizen unequally. On the one hand, those with debts, such as mortgages, were easily able to pay them off, and asset-rich individuals were generally able to hold on to these assets and then to buy more assets in a crippled economy, thus advancing their position in society as the economy gradually improved. Those worst affected, however, were the lower and middle classes, those reliant on salaries which were simply unable to keep pace with the rapid change in the value of the currency. And this group in particular were most likely then to be drawn into the extremes of politics and political leaders such as Adolf Hitler, who seemed to offer some sort of solution to their real economic issues. Throughout the early years of the Weimar Republic, there were a series of attempted revolts and coups, as different groups attempted to overthrow the new regime and create a new Germany. The first of these was the Spartacist uprising of 1919. The Spartacist League was an extreme left group based in Berlin and was a strong supporter of the German Communist Party. Already at this point, the Communist Party had some 400,000 members. And Germany, in early 1919, was still in a state of flux, with questions over leadership still largely up in the air. The Social Democrat Party, led by Friedrich Ebert, had effectively inherited power in the abdication of the Kaiser, but this was not a sure thing. When Ebert removed the chief of the Berlin police in January 1919, the Spartacists seized the opportunity. They pounced. Calls were made for a general uprising and strikes in the capital, and soon over 100,000 men had taken to the streets. The Weimar Republic had not even been declared at this point, and so Ebert was in a tricky position. He needed a solution to bring an end to this violence and to quash the attempted seizure of power. However, the German armed forces had effectively been disbanded immediately following the war, and what was left was in no position to put down any armed uprising. However, Ebert realized there was a potential solution. The city was filled with thousands of ex-soldiers. Dismissed from the armed services after the war, they had returned to Germany, and most importantly, had been allowed to keep their weapons. Many of these soldiers had a firm hatred of the communists. And so Ebert ordered the officers among them to form what were called Freikorps, military units, in effect a paramilitary organization, and tasked them with the defeat of the Spartacists. By the 13th of January, they'd done this, and the rebels had been pushed from the streets, their leaders killed. In order to do this, however, Ibert had allowed paramilitary organizations to arm themselves and violently act to put down opposition. This would become a staple of many political parties during the Weimar Republic. Groups like the Nazi Brown Shirts were a normal and accepted part of the political process in Germany. Further, arming the Freikorps would provide Ibert with further challenges to his own rule and the rule of the Weimar Republic. Ibert had created a dangerous group in the Freikorps, and it didn't take long for them to get out of control. When he attempted to disband and send some of them home in December 1920, they acted angrily. 5,000 Freikorps troops would take over Berlin as the Weimar government fled. They quickly placed Wolfgang Kapp, a civil servant and supporter of the Kaiser, in charge. Significantly, this attempted coup appears to have had the support of the military. They did not act against Kapp or the Freikorps, and appear at least to have accepted his authority. But when news broke in Berlin that Kapp was attempting to bring the Kaiser back into the country, the people of Berlin went on strike and completely paralyzed the whole nation. The Kapp putsch lasted only 6 days before it fell apart, not because of an armed response, but because the people of Germany threw their support behind the Weimar Republic. Now, despite this, political assassinations and violence remained commonplace in the Weimar Republic. There were 376 political murders between 1919 and 1922. Most of those murdered were moderate and left-wing politicians. Not one single right-wing assassin was convicted for murder. Many of the judges were openly supportive of them. This is clearly seen in the follow-up to the Nazis' 1923 Beer Hall Putsch. Yet another attempted revolt, yet another attempted coup d'etat by an extremist group that the Weimar Republic would struggle to respond effectively to. We're going to cover the Beer Hall Putsch in further detail in another video. The period of 1923 to 1929 are sometimes called the golden years of the Weimar Republic. The fledgling democracy seemed to solve many of the issues that had plagued its early years, and Germany was on its way to return to the levels of power and respect that it had had prior to World War I. Much of this revitalization can be put down to Gustav Stresemann, who was appointed Chancellor in August 1923. Whilst he would only remain Chancellor for a brief stint, he would then remain on as Foreign Secretary until his death in 1929. Stresemann's first job was to fix the broken German economy, which at the time he came to power was reaching the very heights of the hyperinflation crisis. The first step was recognizing that there was really no way to fix their current system of currency, the paper mark. The only solution would actually be to issue a whole new system of currency. This he would do in 1923 with the introduction of the Rentenmark. Now, generally, the value of currency is tied to gold reserves held by various countries. But in post-war Germany, this was not an option. Stresemann recognized that he would have to peg the value of this new currency on something else, on real goods. In this case, it would be the physical land of Germany that was used for agriculture and industry. The government would print new currency to a total of 3.2 billion Rentenmarks, and citizens could exchange their old money with the new currency at a rate of 10 trillion old marks to 1 Rentenmark. This would place the value of the new Rentenmark at about US $4. In 1924, control over this new currency was then placed in the hands of the Reichsbank, and the inflation crisis was at an end. But to ensure a similar crisis could not happen again, Stresemann realized he would need to deal with the root causes of hyperinflation. This meant coming to some sort of solution on the issue of reparations, which had crippled the economy, and also trying to get the French out of the Ruhr Valley. Both of these would be solved by the 1924 negotiation of the Dawes Plan. This was an international effort to solve many of the economic issues that the Treaty of Versailles had actually created worldwide. The main features of this plan were the evacuation of French troops from the Ruhr, a stagnated approach to reparation payments, which would see smaller payments to begin with that would grow larger in a few years, and lastly, significant loans of US $200 million from US banks to German industry. This money would enable the German economy to stabilize and begin to build new businesses and trade, and this in turn would increase the revenue for the Weimar Republic, which could be used to meet the reparation payments to the French and the United Kingdom. Finally, with some amount of reparation payments coming in, France and the UK could begin to pay off their significant wartime loans to the USA. The Dawes Plan would be followed by the Young Plan in 1929. Here, Stresemann was able to gain more concessions from the wartime allies. Reparation payments were cut by 20%, from the 132 billion gold marks that were initially demanded to only 112 billion gold marks. Along with this, the time in which Germany had to repay this debt was significantly increased. The final repayment would not actually be due until 1988. This would drastically reduce the amount of reparations required each year. These two plans were incredibly effective in rebuilding the German economy. Foreign loans encouraged industrial and commercial growth. Significant reductions in yearly reparation payments enabled the government to slash income tax, giving the public far more money to spend and further enhancing the economic growth of the Republic. Next, in his role as Foreign Secretary, Stresemann set about restoring Germany's shattered diplomatic reputation on the world stage. The first step in this direction occurred in 1925 with the signing of the Locarno Pact. Germany, Britain, France, and Belgium came together to negotiate improved relations. Germany would come to accept many of the territorial provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this was significant because Germany was a party to these negotiations rather than being dictated to, as they had at the Paris peace talks. Beyond this, France promised peace with Germany, meaning they no longer needed to worry about another invasion as had occurred in the Ruhr. Britain and France, as the controlling members of the League of Nations, also agreed to begin discussions over German involvement in the League of Nations. These discussions would come to fruition when, in 1926, Germany would be invited to join the League of Nations, even becoming a permanent member of the Security Council, along with Britain and France. For a country that had been denied even the right to speak in their defense following their defeat in World War I, they had certainly come far. The last significant achievement in the golden years of the Weimar Republic was the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. This agreement would see Germany and 61 other nations all come together to agree to use peaceful measures to solve potential conflicts. In a few short years, Stresemann had successfully transformed Germany from a pariah state beset with economic disaster to a prosperous and respected nation, recognized once more as a major power. And this had a dramatic impact on the popularity of the more extreme political parties within the Reichstag. As the public saw moderate politicians like Stresemann gain success, they gained confidence in the democratic system, along with a more moderate view on politics. This saw parties such as the Social Democrats grow in party powers, while groups such as the Nazis and Communists lost influence. Despite this, there were still members of these extreme parties, and they riled against Stresemann and the agreements he made, arguing that they were putting Germany back and that no agreement should ever have been made that it accepted the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. This attitude can clearly be seen through this 1929 cartoon in Der Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper. It shows a Jewish doctor standing behind a clearly injured Germany, ready to give him yet another injection. The Versailles Treaty and Young Plan are both depicted as plaster casts. The Dawes Plan is shown as a cut on his arm bleeding into a bucket of reparations. His crutches are labelled as credit, and the two bandages on his head for the Locarno and Geneva treaties, giving us a clear indication of what the Nazi Party believed about Stresemann's achievements. To these extremists, the success of the hated liberal democracy was not something to be celebrated. They continued to work toward the destruction of the Weimar Republic. But so long as the situation in Germany continued to improve, it appeared that they were arguing in vain. The golden years were not to last. Stresemann himself had warned that the economic position is only flourishing on the surface. Germany is in fact dancing on a volcano. If the short-term credits are called in, a large section of our economy would collapse. Stresemann would die on October 3rd, 1929, and 3 weeks later, the Wall Street crash in the US would see the value of US stocks halve in only a few days. This would send the whole world into the midst of the Great Depression. International trade collapsed, and the US immediately began calling in its loans from other nations, including the $200 million loan that had been provided to Germany under the Dawes Plan. The German government tried and failed to adequately deal with the economic reality that they were now faced with. And as the situation worsened, all the hard work of Stresemann seemed to be undone. President Paul von Hindenburg began to effectively govern Germany via Article 48. And the split nature of the parties meant that effective coalitions were not able to be formed. Usage of Article 48 grew more common. By 1932, it was used 60 times. This coincided with a massive reduction in the amount of times the Reichstag actually met, showing that the Weimar Republic was already well on its way to being governed by dictatorial means. When we go on to plot unemployment on this same chart, we get a further indication of the devastating impact that the Depression had on the Republic. Reaching a height of 30% unemployment in 1932, the pattern is very clear to see. As the government seemed unable to adequately deal with the issues they were being faced with, the opposition within the Weimar Republic began to grow. The makeup of the Reichstag changed, reflecting the increasingly extreme views many Germans had come to hold, due in part to the economic crises that Germany was facing. Moderate parties, such as the Social Democrats, lost power, whilst more extreme parties such as the Communists and Nazis came to dominate the Reichstag. By 1933, the final elections under the Weimar Republic, these extreme parties would hold more than half the seats, and the Social Democrats would continue to lose power and influence. These extremist parties were open about their desire to destroy the Republic. Hitler and his Nazis made no secret about their desire to return Germany to a dictatorial, authoritarian regime. But such was the climate at the time that they still received growing support upon this platform. Just opposition from extremist parties. It was the very bureaucracy itself that was against the Republic, helping it to fail. As Richard Evans comments, Weimar was weak in its political legitimacy from the start. It was beset by insurmountable problems and political violence. It was unloved and undefended by its servants in the army and the bureaucracy. We saw how the earlier Kapp putsch seemed to have the support of the army, that right-leaning judges favored those who held their political views, allowing murderers to get away with murder. The contemporary US journalist Edgar Morin perhaps put it best when he reflects on the collapsing regime, saying, "What can be said for a republic that allows its laws to be interpreted by monarchist judges, its government to be administered by old-time functionaries, watches passively while revolutionary school teachers teach its children to despise the present freedom. Whilst the Weimar government had ruled Germany for some 13 years and had gained support from many German citizens, it struggled where it counted to gain legitimacy, to gain power and authority, the authority it required to rule Germany despite the challenges that it faced. This has been History for the HSC and our deep dive into the collapse of the Weimar Republic, a promising government who, despite some great successes, were never truly able to gain the authority to rule a stable Germany, and collapse due to a combination of internal and external factors. In reality, this is the first part of a double episode. The second will be focusing on how the Nazi Party during this period took advantage of the situation and the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic in order to gain a legal dictatorship over Germany. So join us next week as we explore the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party.